Okay, let's start. Hi, this is Victoria. This is Dr. Victoria Nalule. And here with me is Miss Pedi from Accra, Ghana, right?
Yes, yes.
And today she's going to expound more on her opinion with respect to the political will to develop the energy sector in Africa. But before we start, I would like her to briefly introduce herself.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Pedi Obani. Thank you very much, Victoria, for introducing me and for inviting me to this program to share my views. I'm a lawyer by training. I have a degree in law, and I've also been called to the bar in Nigeria. So I come from Nigeria, even though I'm in Accra at the moment. In terms of training, I have a degree in law and sustainable development. That's what I did my master's in. And I have a strong passion, I would say, for sustainability issues. I've done some research around the oil and gas sector in Nigeria, but also in other African countries. I was part of the research team for the United Nations University that looked at the issue of stranded hydrocarbon assets in Africa. And the report for that was launched at the last COP last year. So to a large extent, my recent research experience has been around the issues of oil and gas management in African countries. And on the other hand, the issue of climate change as well. So the intersections between the oil and gas sector, energy, and then climate change and how this plays out on the ground in African countries. So in line with that, I thought that it would be useful to share my opinion and experiences with you. And when you asked the question about political will, that's what informed my response really. So I'm happy to expound on that here today. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm really impressed by your qualifications. That means we have the right person to really take us through the issue of political will. So before we
Thank
start,
you.
I will just briefly read out your opinion so that you can
Mhm.
expound on it. So I asked a question on whether we have the political will in Africa to develop our energy sector, and this followed an energy debate I had organized on whether Africa were ready to bid farewell to fossil fuels. And in your response, briefly, you said the political will is not lacking. The main questions for me are who defines forward, how, or whom. The energy sector offers an entry point addressing systematic inequalities in well-being and access to development opportunities across the continent. Moving away from fossil fuels should not mean stranding resources and abandoning communities already suffering. So I'll not read everything, but in your opinion, what I get is that we have the political will, but we also have to ensure that we utilize the resources to benefit the local people who are suffering and also to address the poverty issues we have on the continent together with energy access issues. So I'd like you to expound on your opinion and tell us more about what you think is lacking in Africa if it's not the political.
Um, Again, thank you very much. So yes, I do not think that the political will is lacking. And the reason I say this is that if we look across the continent, we will find that African countries have been very much engaged with the international processes for climate change action. I should also state that when I think about energy action or energy policies in Africa, I also think about it in connection with climate change because the global discourse and even the regional discourse around energy also has a large bearing or has a lot of links with climate change as well. So the discourse is about moving away from sources of energy that are not clean or that are not sustainable or that increase carbon emissions. So this is the global focus, and it also translates into the focus of energy policy in many African countries. So it's really about the action that is already going on around energy and the action that's already going on around climate change. And when I look at those two, I see that African countries are showing a lot of commitment in the space of climate action. So they've been part of the UNFCCC processes. Most of them have submitted their nationally determined contributions, which show a commitment to climate change action, adaptation and mitigation action. And all this shows that there's some political will already. Another reason I think that there's already political will is a lot of African countries also have policies, national policies on climate change. Some of them have national laws, some of them have climate change being reflected in their national adaptation frameworks or in their development plans. So if you look at long-term development plans for a lot of African countries, it includes policies or includes provisions on energy, and also includes some things that have relevance for climate action. So to that extent, I think that yes, there's political will. And lastly, I would say that another reason I think there's political will is within Africa, we also have countries that are already making a lot of progress around renewable energy, for instance. So Morocco is one of the countries that is already being looked at as one that will meet its targets. For, I think Morocco has targets for 52% of its electricity from renewables by 2030, and they're on course to achieving that. And you have countries like Nigeria, for instance, where you have not just the national governments, but even the sub-national governments. For instance, a state in Nigeria, Cross River State, doing very well in terms of REDD+, and doing very well in terms of even establishing a sub-national ministry that is in charge of climate change and forestry. So all this for me showed political will. So it brings me to the other part of the question, which is moving forward. And for me, that's the real question. What does forward mean? You know, because if we want to define moving forward, then it has to be defined in a way that meets the development needs of the continent. Otherwise, we would have the motions of forward movement, but we wouldn't have the benefits. And moving forward in quotes without the benefits of making progress in terms of access to energy that is sustainable, that is clean, that is actually accessible and affordable for most of the people. These are the main things. And that's where the question lies. So for me, in that, when I submitted the opinion piece, I said it's about how do we define forward, who is defining it, and who is it being defined for? And in terms of how do we define forward, so take the example of a country like Nigeria that has oil and gas resources. Will moving forward for Nigeria mean leaving the oil and gas resources in the ground and then getting renewable energy? If we take that as meaning moving forward, can the renewable energy actually meet the development needs of Nigeria at this point in time? And how many Nigerians can afford renewable energy? If we think about it and we agree that majority of Africans lack access to basic electricity. And by this majority, we're talking about 55% of the continent. Then it means that the forward movement has to take into consideration the needs of that 55%. And the needs actually transcend just having electricity in terms of being able to power a bulb. It affects every aspect of life for the average African. Without electricity, you cannot have good health care. Because without electricity, you cannot keep the vaccines or you cannot keep the medicines at the right temperature in the hospitals. You can't even run equipment in the hospitals. Without electricity, you can't even have access to water, because a lot of countries or in a lot of places, you have lack of access to water, not because the facilities are not there, but because they cannot power the pumps. So they do not have the electricity to power the pumps. Without electricity, you can't even have sustainable food systems. Without electricity, there's so many implications, even for education. So I think we need to think about all these as a whole and understand the forward movement in the energy sector as a means to actually achieving progress in the other areas as well. If we think about it just in terms of having access to renewables or having access to the solar panels, then that may not really work. And we also need to think about it in terms of reducing the gap. Because, I mean, between 2010 and 2018, for instance, the data shows that there's been an improvement in access to electricity. But where is that improvement occurring? It's not occurring in Africa as much as it's occurring in other continents. So it means that we have to think about an African sensitive way of measuring progress. And maybe that would actually require some kind of tweaking of what we mean by forward movement. That's what I really think. And the reason I think this is because if we think about the issue of affordability, I mean, when we look at the figures, those who do not have access are usually poor people. And those who do not have access, usually there's a disparity between urban areas and rural areas. So the forward movement has to be defined in a way that addresses these groups in vulnerable situations, the poor people, the people in rural areas, because they also deserve access to electricity. They deserve access to energy. Without this, they wouldn't be able to live a good quality of life. Some African countries are in the tropic regions. Temperatures are rising. It means that there also has to be a way of cooling. And in some cases, you have countries that experience winters in Africa. It means there has to be a way of heating. And these are all energy needs. And if we're talking about modern energy forms for these people, and we're talking about people who cannot afford to pay high costs, then we have to take that into consideration. Another thing for me is even in terms of renewables, can they really provide the kind of stable energy required for development, industrial processes? If the answer is no, not yet, then I think we have to then find a way of meeting the pressing needs of the continent. Bearing in mind that the renewables may not be able to provide the immediate needs in terms of I mean, a lot of African countries are carbon intensive or energy intensive. So I'm not saying let us remain carbon intensive, but I'm saying considering that the needs are energy intensive, let us find ways of addressing these needs without jeopardizing the development of the continent. And if we think about the fact that the continent has about 17% of the world population, but only contributes about 2% of energy related or electricity related emissions, then I think it's only fair that the 2%, even if it goes up a bit, but that percentage is allowed, because without it, then all the development goals for the continent will be compromised as well. It brings us to the question of, oh, but what about the environment? Are you saying let's throw the environment out of it? No, the environment is very important, because at the end of the day, even the oil and gas resources or the carbon intensive sources of fuel that we rely on, they have caused problems for the environment in Africa as well. I mean, local communities who have been host communities to oil exploration activities, for instance, the Niger Delta of Nigeria, it is no news that there have been very severe environmental problems. But I also say that even when we look at the renewables, we look at DRC, for instance, and we've already started hearing stories about extraction of minerals used in the renewable sector that is already happening in an unsustainable manner. So it shows that it's not just about changing the energy sources, but it's also about changing the governance process. So part of the question was, what should we do? So for me, what we should do is understand, first of all, who lacks energy. And I think it's pretty much clear who lacks it, but maybe it's not even as clear as it should be, because a lot of the surveys we have right now look about disaggregate the data into urban rural. But I think beyond urban rural, we need to look at even the urban areas. Not everybody has access to energy. So who are those who do not have access, even in the urban areas? And then of course, in the rural areas, who are those who do not have access? Is access to energy tied to, for instance, ownership of property? Is it tied to the kind of property people live in? Because if you want a solar panel, you have to have a certain kind of roof. If you live in a certain kind of house, you may not be able to install solar panels in that house. And if you do not even have legal rights to the house, you may not have the incentive. Let's not even go into the ability or the financial capacity, but you may not even have the legal rights to make alterations to the property in which you live to install fittings that would allow for renewable energy. So those kinds of factors will only come in when we try to understand the root causes of lack of access to energy. And I think one cause that it's very, I should also mention, of course, that I mean, African countries are different. Not the same rules will not apply in every country, but speaking generally, one important issue would be funding, because we already know that there's a funding gap. So how do we close that funding gap? And I think that in closing that funding gap, we cannot just rely on the markets, because if we rely on the markets, it will become a case of ability to pay. If you pay, you get energy. And I think it shouldn't be that, because we realize that energy is expensive as it stands now. And those who cannot pay, they just can't pay. Because if you talk about people who are living on what, $2 a day, less than $2 a day, or less than $1 a day, then people should not be forced to make choices between one basic need and the other. Because remember that amount they have is the same amount that will go into food, it will go into water, it will go into sanitation, it will go into healthcare, it will go into education, it will go into energy. So people should not be put in a position where they have to make these kinds of choices with limited amounts of monies that they have. And I think that brings us to understanding energy as a public good. It just has to be understood as a public good and governed as such, so that even for those who cannot afford to pay, of access that at least allows them to live a dignified life. They have that basic access, because without it, even economic activities cannot be promoted. But if you have access to energy, then it's easy for people to start thinking about what to do with their time, how to employ their time productively, how to educate themselves through different sources. So that is very important. So for me, one thing is to understand what are the root causes. The second thing is to understand how do we fund it? And we cannot rely on the poor to fund energy users for themselves, at least not just yet, until they are empowered to an extent where they can now rely on themselves. But that basic level of access has to be assured for them. And it has to come with the government support. So, I mean, if we think about it like that, and it brings in the role of the government as a lead. The government has to facilitate, but the government also has to lead to ensure that there's provision for those who need it the most but cannot afford to pay. And I think that it is important in line with this that every intervention in the energy sector is built towards reducing the gap in access. So it's not about providing more access for those who already have, but it should be about reducing the gap between those who have and those who do not have. So rural areas, while it may not make a lot of economic sense, depending on how you want to define economic sense. But I honestly think that if we think about it holistically and we look at the implications of lack of access to energy for different aspects of human life, it will start to make economic sense. But then again, we shouldn't be thinking about economic sense because this is about the quality of life of people as human beings. So it shouldn't make economic sense for us to provide an enabling environment for people to live well as human beings. And I think another thing that would come up in thinking about going forward with the energy sector in Africa is the issue of emissions, whether we like it or not. You know, are we at a point where we can say zero emissions? Yes, right now, every emission counts, no doubt. But are we at the point where we should say to Africa, shut down your emissions completely? And the reason I ask this is because for many African countries that have oil and gas already, they even see gas as a transition fuel. Because while you want to reduce emissions, you have this huge infrastructural deficit. You need to be able to build your roads, you need to be able to build your industries, you need to be able to build facilities. How do you power these things? You cannot rely on renewable, in quotes, renewable sources of energy to do this. Because I mean, without batteries, for instance, how do you store the amount of energy? And when we even speak to people in the field, in the engineering field and infrastructure, they tell you that I think it's called the base load. For the base load, they still have to rely on these other sources of energy that are not clean. So how do we create that balance? I think that balance has to be created because it's all about the issue of just transitions. So we are moving, but the movement has to be just. The transition has to be just. And the transition being just has to take into consideration the current energy deficits in the continent, the sources, the resources that the continent has to close this gap and seeing how best this gap can be closed, taking into consideration the populations in vulnerable situations. And I think that the last thing I would say is that we also have to remember that the continent before now, a lot of African countries would rely on hydro energy, right? Hydro dams for electricity generation. And hydro used to be considered as a renewable source, but right now it's debatable, especially because of issues of climate change. So you have countries that used to rely on the dams. Now the dams have become old. They haven't invested in renewing the infrastructure. And then some of them are also experiencing shortages in water supply. And because of the shortages in water supply, they're not able to run the dams at full capacity to meet the energy needs. With climate change coming, with rising temperatures in many places already, then it shows that even these hydropower dams are becoming unsustainable, in quotes, this large infrastructure for electricity, they're becoming unsustainable. And then people are moving to smaller, what do you call them now? Decentralized infrastructure for electricity generation. And you even have countries, for instance, in Zambia, you have a situation where they are now even going back to coal as a way of meeting the gap that has been created by the dams not functioning as much as well as they can, and by the dams not being able to provide electricity for the full population. They're now going back to coal as a way of meeting the energy needs of industry, and also as a way of meeting the shortfall in electricity from the grid. Now, do you tell that country to stop using the coal completely, especially when they tell you that the coal that they are using is not dirty coal? that is debatable, what is dirty and what is clean. But my point is that every country is at a different stage of development. Energy is still a very critical need. And we have to understand that what works for these countries will depend on their unique circumstances. And we shouldn't be quick to prescribe a solution for everybody, but instead, we should try to understand what are the root causes of the inequalities. Funding is a big issue. How can we support each other as a continent? And how can the rest of the world also support developing countries and continents that actually face these deficits in energy to close the gap sustainably? This also has an implication for, I would say, maybe I should say this would be the last thing I would say. This also has an implication for technology. Now, for technology, and I'm saying this because a lot of the technology for renewables is also not coming from the continents. So it means that there will also be dependence on external sources for the supply of the technology, for repairs. And for me, that seems almost like another vicious cycle starting again. The cycle of you have to rely on external sources to provide the technology you need. You have to rely on external sources to maintain. And we already know that once we lack the local capacity to understand this technology, to operate it, to maintain it, that's already a recipe for disaster. So that is another thing that needs to be taken into consideration in understanding this movement forward. I think the technology aspect has to be deeply considered, and we have to invest in building the capacity of the continent to actually produce technology that suits our environment, and then technology that we can manage locally. I mean, with COVID-19, for instance, there's been a lot of disruption in global supply chains. And I think that emphasizes that need for a local understanding of technology and a local ability to manage technology. And the energy sector just portrays it really well. Because if we have technology that we do not understand, even though it may be renewable, and but if we're not able to manage it locally, we're not able to ensure that it's adapted to our needs locally, then it won't help us in moving forward in the energy sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That is really extensive. I think you've covered almost everything with respect to energy issues in Africa, energy transition, and political will. I've liked the points you've raised about the energy challenges we face on the continent, and also the fact that we're moving towards industrialization, urbanization, and renewables alone cannot take us through the industrial process we're anticipating, even the population growth, because on the African continent we expect that the population will increase. So with an increased population, that means more demand for energy. So you've raised many important issues, but I'll just pick up on an issue with respect to using natural gas to as a as a clean form of energy to take us through a transition, but also to help us to finance the necessary infrastructure, also getting the funds we need to invest more in renewables, because most people are seeing now fossil fuels, including oil and gas, as a source of revenue. So we can use the revenue to not only um, invest in the developmental infrastructure we need, but also to invest more in renewable energy. So I'd like you to expand more on the issue of natural gas, because I know in Nigeria and other African countries like Mozambique, they're really, really counting on their natural gas to ensure access to energy and also for the economic development. So what do you think African countries, or do you think African countries are doing enough in the development of their natural gas? If not, what should be the way forward, just on the focus on natural gas alone?
Okay, thank you very much for that, Victoria. So in terms of, I think you've asked two questions. Do I think they're doing enough?
Yes.
And then what do I think about using natural gas as a transition fuel, more or less? Okay, thank you. So in terms of whether I think they're doing enough, that would be on a case-by-case basis. So it's a bit difficult for me to sit here and say they are doing enough or they're not doing enough. But you've mentioned the case of Nigeria, for instance, and if I were to take that as an example, I would say at least they are starting to do a lot. And the reason I say they're starting to do a lot is that our law on reinjection of natural gas goes back decades. So we've had this issue of gas flaring in Nigeria. Practically everybody knows about it. You go to the communities where the gas is being the oil and gas exploration process is going on, and then you see those huge fires burning. So for many decades, communities have been exposed to the health hazards of gas flaring, and then of course the implications on the environment, the health of the people, and even the economy. In fact, economies have been built around it, which is really sad. You've had communities drying food from the heat, using the heat from the gas flares, probably not understanding the health implications of this. So now the government is really invested in moving forward with tapping into those gas flares as a resource and not something to be wasted. So that's movement, and I think that is in the right direction for many reasons. One, for the environmental reasons, because the environment, once those gas flares end, of course the issues of acid rain, all the environmental problems that have been built or that have been going on this past years just because of the flares will be reduced. Now, the damage that has already been done will not be addressed automatically because the gas flares end, but at least going forward, there wouldn't be more contributions to the existing problem. So that is one. On the social side of it, the health of the people will improve also, because at least there wouldn't be more contributions of flares to the environment hurting people's health. And then on the economic side, which I think is a point of entry, is a very important point of entry that the government has recognized, the government would also be able to get investments in infrastructure that now uses this gas for providing not just LPG in terms of cooking gas, but also energy for homes, for industries, and things like that. So there's a lot of progress being made in that direction, and I think it's a good progress. So maybe for me that is an example of moving forward, because we are moving away from just flaring gas, endangering people's lives, endangering the environment, and now moving towards ensuring that this gas now becomes a resource. But I think the question still remains about who will fund it, because it's an expensive process. In the case of Nigeria, for instance, it's being opened up for private investors to come in. And at the end of the day, there's also the question of the price. At what price will the gas be sold? Because before now, we had based on the principle of polluter pays, we already had a system in place where companies had to pay for flaring the gas. So it wasn't that the gas was being flared for free. No, but there was a penalty for doing it. But the fact that it persisted shows that that penalty was not enough to ensure that people had an incentive not to flare the gas. So I think the same thing would play out even in efforts to ensure that this gas now becomes a resource and is used by people. I think that there has to be a balance between the amount of investments that has to be made in converting this resource into, I mean, in realizing the potential of this resource as an important source of energy, and what it would mean in the alternative if people were just to leave that resource and go for something else that wouldn't be as beneficial for the environment. So that balance needs to be achieved. Otherwise, we may find that even the government is putting in a lot of effort in trying to ensure that people now stop flaring the gas and start using natural gas for productive purposes, people decide that it's too expensive to do that. But I think we also have to be cautious, because while on the one hand, we want to attract these investments, we do not want to make the mistakes of the past. And by that, I mean that there still has to be regulation in place. There still has to be processes in place, checks to ensure that these private investors that are coming in do it with a humane face. They do it in such a way that energy is still accessible to those who need it the most. And I think it comes back to my initial issue of ensuring that the energy is accessible to everybody, even those who may not be able to pay. So yes, they're making progress in terms of trying to use the natural gas. And I think it's happening in many African countries, even Tanzania, for instance. There's a lot of efforts being made around there. And I think even in Ghana here, the government is also trying to do the same thing. And many of those processes are also linking the infrastructure for gas to industrial plants, to even for use in agriculture. So it's not even just for energy, but also to see how this can be used in other processes as well around the economy. So a lot of efforts are being made, yes. But I think that it's a step in the right direction, yes, because it's helping the environment and at the same time it's providing the much needed energy. But my call to caution is that we should ensure that in trying to attract the necessary investments, we still protect the rights, the well-being of people, and then we also protect the environment. We shouldn't be too eager to attract the investments at the expense of people's livelihoods or people's health or the environment. And I think it also comes to the question of the kinds of houses people live in. Because I think that there's a lot of, there are safety issues around the use of gas. Now, around the use of gas as a cooking fuel, for instance, there are safety issues. Of course, there are safety issues with the use of everything, even with the use of other forms of energy. But I think that those safety issues need to be taken into consideration, and it would have implications, I am very sure, for the kinds of houses people live in, for the kinds of, not only the kinds of houses, but even for the arrangements in which people live. So, for instance, if people are living in informal settlements that are very dense, then it may have some implications for whether or not they can use gas and how they can use it. So I think that points to the issue of having an intersectoral outlook or plan in using the natural gas. So for me, it shouldn't be natural gas as an end in itself, but it should be, first of all, natural gas as a transition fuel to something cleaner. You mentioned the fact that the investments, the money is coming from the use of or the sale of the natural gas need to be reinvested, yes. And so the reinvestment should prioritize cleaner forms of energy and should also prioritize accessibility, especially for those who cannot afford to pay. And then the wider issues of the kinds of housing people live in, those issues should also be taken into consideration. So if we look at natural gas as a means to an end, and if that end takes into consideration the populations in vulnerable situations, those in housing that are of poor standards, or those who cannot afford to pay for energy themselves, those who lack basic access, if we think about all those things in designing the use of natural gas, and if we also think about the environment very importantly, then I think that I would say it's a step in the right direction. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Pendi. I think you've exhausted everything. I'll not ask any other follow-up questions, but I'd like to thank you very much for your time, for the opinion, and also for being sincere about what really needs to be done in Africa. So just
It's
for
my pleasure, Victoria.
so I'll just give you a chance to do closing remarks, just 1 minute to do your closing remarks, summarizing everything.
Okay. Thank you very much, Victoria. In closing, I would say that there's one thing that I think is very important in thinking about going forward with the energy sector, and I think that's the gender issue. I didn't touch on it directly, but I think it's something I would like to emphasize. When we look at the current structure for energy in most African countries, women are largely lacking. If you look at the oil companies, I mean, when we did the research for the stranded assets and we visited I physically visited Ghana, Zambia, Nigeria, and I can count on one hand how many women we spoke to. And it wasn't for want of trying. We were trying to speak to people in government, we're trying to speak to people in the private sector, we're trying to speak to people in different sectors and different stakeholders that had bearing on the energy sector. And you find that it is very difficult to speak with women in positions of authority. And I think that has very serious implications because when it comes to the ground and the use of energy, especially in places where they lack energy, we see that women are very much impacted. So I feel like that gap needs to be closed so that women are also represented in those spaces where the decisions around energy are being made. Because if women are not represented there, then chances are that the unique needs of women will also not translate into those policies. We still think about energy as a very technocratic issue. And I think that's not the case because energy has very serious social implications, serious environmental implications, and economic implications. So if we think about it holistically, then a technocratic focus on just the infrastructure will not satisfy it. So I think that needs to be done. And if we even look at it, the representation of women in STEM, so in the sciences, technology, engineering, mathematics is very low. So I think efforts need to be made there to ensure that women are represented both in terms of education, So in the fields that have a bearing on energy, women are represented there. And also in terms of employment in the sector. I mean, nothing stops women from going to, well, I don't want to say to the rigs because we're moving away from fossil fuels, but I'm just saying that engineering courses and then being employed in those fields, nothing stops women from doing that. So if we find that there is a gap, and I think there is a gap, then efforts should be made to try to close that gap. It's very important. It's something that I feel very strongly about. And I think that Africa needs to do a lot about. Our women shouldn't just be consumers of energy, but they should also be in the space where they can decide how those energy resources get allocated, how people access them. And I think that would actually help in terms of outcomes and in terms of reducing the inequities or inequalities in access to energy. So gender for me is a very important aspect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedi, and thank you very much for raising very important issues that really need to be addressed in the energy sector. In summary, I would say you've raised issues concerning technology, gender equality, and also we have to distinguish the fact that people who lack access are different from urban areas and rural areas, and then also the need for infrastructure development and finances to transition to a low carbon economy. So this marks the end of our webinar. It's live on YouTube. It's also, I've already advertised it on the various social media. I've tagged you along. So do not forget.
Thank you very much.
Do not forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel, and also you can share the video with all your contacts. And we shall make it, we shall feature it on the NGO that I'm managing, the African Energy and Minerals Management Initiative. It's already on the social media for the NGO. So thank you very much, Pedi, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you very much, Victoria, and keep up the good work. Really good work. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.